Please note, this program was recorded before the death of Rush Limbaugh.
It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, everybody.
And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, Steve, and hello, everybody. This is a generic show. It's on talk radio.
Yeah. Well, picture this. Hundreds of AM, FM radio stations across the country filled their broadcasts with progressive talk radio. Shock jocks talking about why the Green New Deal doesn't go far enough to reverse the impact of climate change. Substantial debates over Medicare for all and your commute. Local stations interviewing police reform advocates and labor organizers. Progressive discourse happening on the public airwaves free of charge, tailored to local markets, addressing the topics their communities care about, inspiring them to take action and affect change. It sounds like some sort of fantasy world, doesn't it? Well, it kind of is. As it stands, the talk radio landscape is absolutely dominated by right-wing influence. So-called conservatives have built a robust network of local stations across the country, developed trusting long-term relationships with their listeners, and use those relationships to shape hearts and minds. You could drive for hours without hitting a single progressive radio station unless you pay for satellite radio or live in a major city. It's no wonder the Democrats get painted as coastal elites and corporate Republicans can sell themselves as populists. If our political discourse is essentially determined by where we live and who can get in our ears, how can we change this? That's what we'll be asking our guest today, Thom Hartmann. Thom Hartmann is a notable exception. He's probably the most prominent progressive radio host out there. He's put together a comprehensive plan of action to turn that leftist radio fantasy into a reality. So we'll be talking to Thom. As usual, somewhere in between, we will take a break to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, what would happen if progressive voices had the same reach as reactionary ones? David?
Thom Hartmann is one of America's most popular progressive talk radio hosts, a writing fellow at the Independent Media Institute, and the author of more than 30 books, including The Hidden History of American Oligarchy. We previously had him on this program back in July of 2019, and he called then President Donald Trump a racist, a criminal, a thief, and a rapist. In retrospect, that appears to be an understatement. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Thom Hartmann.
David, Ralph, Matthew, Hannah, thank you, all of you, and Steve. Thank you.
Welcome back, Thom. I think it's going to be pretty engrossing for our listeners because one point you make is that progressive listeners of talk radio very rarely tune in to Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Savage, Levin. They dominate the top 15 rated radio shows in the country. And you started one of your articles by quoting a headline from the New York Times shortly after the November election. And the headline asked, quote, "Why did so many Americans vote for Donald Trump?" End quote. Your response?
Well, in large part because actually I would add two things, or add something to that, but to the point that we're discussing, because every day on a little over 1,000 radio stations coast to coast, we have right-wing hosts who are promoting and who were promoting Donald Trump. They saw him the way that I saw Bernie, somebody who was a little outside the mainstream, but, very much the voice that represented their worldview and just went all in for him. I mean, talk radio across this country went all in for Donald Trump in the primary and then in the general election. And they have no constraints on what they can say and how accurate it has to be. So you've got that. The other thing I would point out, though, and I think it needs to be said repeatedly, is that when Trump was running for president, he stole Bernie Sanders' platform. I was living in D.C. at the time, and I lived down at the Marina. And a number of the people I knew were ex-military or current enlisted military. And at least 7 people that I knew out of that Marina that I lived in, which was maybe 120 families, at least 7 of them had never voted for a Democrat in their lives. And they were gung-ho for Bernie in the primary. And then they voted for Donald Trump in the general. Trump had come out and said he was going to raise taxes on rich people. He was going to do it so much that his friends were going to hate him and he was going to get killed, I think was the phrase he used, tax-wise. He said that he was going to give everybody in the country high quality, low cost health care, much, much better than Obamacare. He said that he was going to reverse the treaties that Ronald Reagan and Bush the Elder had negotiated, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and NAFTA that Clinton had put into place, and he was going to bring back those 65,000 factories to the United States. I mean, he was lying through his teeth in every point, but a lot of people who voted for him, and I know some of those people, thought that he was actually going to be more progressive than Hillary Clinton would.
Well, you described the New York Times article, which asked why did so many Americans vote for Donald Trump, by saying, and I'm quoting you, weirdly, that article and hundreds like it purporting to explain the previous 2016 election lacked even a single mention of the roughly 1,500 right-wing talk radio stations that saturate every corner, no matter how remote or rural, of America. As a 2008 Pew Research poll found, 16% of Americans get their general election year information about presidential candidates from talk radio, a percentage that has held constant for 8 years at that point, despite the explosive growth of the internet over the same period, end quote. It doesn't make sense to a distant observer, Thom Hartmann. At least half the country disagrees with these talk radio show hosts. And why aren't there more progressive radio stations? Is it because on the conservative radio stations, they go after government, which doesn't advertise, and they appeal and toady up to corporations who do advertise? Is that a good part of the reason why they don't have countervailing progressive radio stations on the public airways, which belong to the public?
I don't think so. I know that's the main pitch that Limbaugh has been making for years, and that for some reason the Fairness Doctrine would have kept him off the air, which is another lie. But what I've found over the years is that if you can generate ad revenue, if you can make sales for radio stations, they will put you on the air. I think really what's going on here, Ralph. For example, by the way, to the point of progressive talk radio. Most people don't remember, aren't old enough to remember, or just never knew that talk radio in the 1970s and 80s was dominated by progressives. Obviously you had, a healthy Pacifica network back then, but also commercial talk radio. In fact, the most famous talk radio host in the United States was a guy named Alan Berg out of Denver. And he was on in 29 states on a blowtorch station out of Denver, an unrepentant progressive. And I forget the year that he was assassinated by two skinheads in the parking lot of the radio station, but I think it was just 2 or 3 years before Limbaugh started his show in '88. I'd have to go back and look. But, they made a movie out of it called Talk Radio. And advertisers had no problem with that. I think the big problem is that prior to 1996, when there were actually a fair number of progressive hosts, local progressive hosts on stations all over the United States, prior to 96, radio stations had to be locally owned. I started in radio when I was 16 years old. I was a weekend DJ on WITL, the country music station in Lansing, Michigan. And I did that for a couple of years and ended up bouncing around other stations, and then came back to Whittle and did news there for 7 years until 1978. And back then, every single radio station in Lansing, I think there were 7 of them, was locally owned by like local families or groups put together by local people. And these were by and large middle-class people too. In fact, I knew the guys who owned WITL. I was an old radio guy, an old engineer, a sales guy, and they scraped together enough money to put a radio station on the air just all by themselves. And I'd been to some of their homes. These were not rich people. But when Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act of '96, these limits that had been since the 1920s on how many radio and television stations and newspapers a single entity, a family or a corporation could own, those limits got blown all to hell. And the local ownership rules, which specified that radio and television stations had to be owned by entities at least within the state, got blown all to hell. And the result of that was very quickly, I mean, that was 96, and within a year and a half, I believe, I'm not sure if I referenced this in the article or not, because I originally wrote that article about twice as long as what ended up getting published. I had to cut a lot out to get down to the word count they wanted. But prior to that, Clear Channel had been this small regional company that owned about 100 radio stations, and or not even 100. And as soon as those ownership caps were blown up, within a year and a half, they owned over 1,000 radio stations nationwide and just came to dominate the American media landscape.
And to replace a lot of local talk radio shows, it was cheaper just to use a syndicated show.
That's correct. And syndicated shows that reflected the worldview of the management and ownership of that giant network. Their biggest competitor, another radio station network that had over 800 radio stations, got acquired by a couple of billionaires. And a United States senator invited one of those two billionaires to his office, along with me, to sit down and discuss this, the fact that they had just bought this network and all these radio stations. And they'd also bought, at the time, the network Westwood One that syndicated my program and the entire progressive lineup, the one good, solid 24/7 progressive lineup in America. They had just bought this. And the senator said, are you going to you've got 800 plus radio stations now, and you've got right-wing talk radio on an awful lot of them. Are you going to put any progressive talk radio on? And this guy looked us in the eye and said, no, I'd never put anybody on the air who wants to raise my taxes. It ain't going to happen. And, which it's like, so how do you deal with that? I don't recall again if it made it into the article, but, I wrote about it in my book on oligarchy, that at one of these talkers conventions, Talkers magazine is kind of the Bible of the talk radio industry. And every year they do a convention in New York, and all these talk show hosts and radio station owners and managers from all over the country get together. And this was a little more than a decade ago. I was sitting, they have a big luncheon with a speaker, and so I was sitting at one of these big round circular tables, and just by coincidence, sitting next to me was one of the senior executives at Salem, which is the radio network that, syndicates Dennis Prager and Hugh Hewitt and those guys. And I said, hey, what would you think about putting my show on your network, offering some balance? And he's like, oh, well, we're owned by a Bible publishing company, and we only put people on who want to promote Christian values. And I'm like, I'm a Christian. I'm a Matthew 25 Christian. I think that's the core of my political philosophy. And he's like, no, you can't be a liberal and be a Christian.
But that's part of it. They're very overt about it. They're very blatant about it.
Yeah.
And let's see what your comments are on the following three shows. The nationally syndicated late night radio show by Larry King between 1987 and 1992, where he opened it up to a lot of liberal voices, conservative voices. He was a very fair-minded person. He never over-talked. Then there was the Diane Rehm show that was widely syndicated out of Washington and for years. And then there was the Terry Gross show, which still is syndicated. Now, some people would say they're center, a little bit to the liberal. How do you compare them with Levin, Savage, Hannity, Limbaugh, when somebody says they got big audiences?
Well, they're different genres, and that's something that people who are not kind of immersed in the radio business don't get. I knew Larry King. He's a great guy, or was a great guy. He passed away recently. But there's a difference between talk radio and interview radio. And there's very few people who can do interview radio in a way that they are essentially invisible. You listen to them for weeks, months, years, and you still don't know what they really think. And Larry King, Diane Rehm, and Terry Gross are all brilliant at that. And that's a skill, frankly, that I don't have. It's a skill that when we were doing Air America, Al Franken didn't have, which is why when he tried to do an interview show, it never really, caught on the way that talk radio does. Talk radio is a completely different animal. Talk radio, which is what I do now on my program, it's what Rush Limbaugh does, it's what most of right-wing talk radio does. And sadly, a lot of left-wing talk radio, these people are still trying to do interview shows. But what I do is when I'm talking to one person on the other end, and it's like a phone call. It's a conversation. It's one-on-one. And I talk directly to the listeners. I take calls that the listeners talk back to me. If I've got a rant, I'm telling one, in my mind, I'm telling the one person who's on the other side of the microphone, and I'll imagine somebody that I know and like, and I talk right to them. And I very rarely have guests on my program unless they either are experts in something that I don't know anything about and they can teach me, or they are politicians who will take calls from our listeners so that we can kind of do a forum, or if they are conservatives who want to disagree with me, because people love debates, people slow down for fistfights and car wrecks. So that's it. I almost never have people that I agree with on my show. There's nothing more boring than two people sitting around talking about something. Oh, I agree with you. No, I agree with you even more, And, I realize that with podcasts, the rules are quite different. But I think on radio, trying to compare what Larry King did which is interview radio, with what Rush Limbaugh does, which is talk radio, is very much comparing apples to oranges.
Well, the leading conservative or corporatist radio talk show hosts that we've just mentioned, how many of them take calls, and do they screen the calls pretty rigorously? Anybody who disputes them never gets
They all
through.
take calls. It's not the major part of their show, but they all take calls. And I'm assuming that they screen their calls much like we do. We basically filter out people who are abusive, obscene, or drunk, or mentally ill. And beyond that, if somebody wants to agree with me or disagree with me, I'll put them on the air and take them on. And I think broadly that's true of your right-wing hosts as well. And the reason why is because when somebody disagrees with the host, that perks, like I said, people slow down for fistfights and car wrecks. That perks the audience up, actually.
You make a distinction with the Democrats spending billions of dollars on paid advertising. Republicans use more this radio model of long-term trusting relationships to get out the vote for GOP. And then you say something most people don't know. You say in 2016, right-wing talk radio gave Donald Trump the boost he needed to put him in the White House. The hosts loved him and promoted him relentlessly. The same goes for George W. Bush. And why? Every weekday, all across America, people get into their cars and drive to and from work listening to the radio, as the nation's largest statistics organization, Statistica, notes, saying, quote, during an average week in September 2020, radio reached 90.9% of all American men aged between 35 and 64 years of age, end quote. How do you justify that? Most people think Trump got a lot of free network TV time, got an enormous amount of Fox TV time, and that's what really got him to people's notice, not talk radio.
I think, again, probably most people not in the radio business don't get the importance of relationship and trust. The main thing that a talk radio host offers their audience is trust, a one-on-one relationship. Television is like voyeuristic, it's like watching, through somebody's living room window. You're watching other people have a life. Interview shows very often are somewhat similar. I've never felt, just from listening to Terry Gross, I get a sense of who she is, but I've never felt like if she were to tell me her opinion, that would be real meaningful to me, because there's not this relationship of trust over the years that I've built up with her. I trust her to ask reasonable questions of people, but, trusting her opinions, I don't know what they are. But for a right-wing or left-wing talk show host who's talking one-on-one to their audience, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, for years, I've been doing this 18 years, you build a relationship that is a relationship of trust. And what comes out of that is that when you endorse a particular point of view or a particular candidate, it's enormously powerful. I used to work in the advertising business. I owned an ad agency in Atlanta, and we sold it in 97. That was the last time I retired. And I can tell you the number one goal of any kind of advertising campaign is to emulate as closely as possible word of mouth advertising. It's why you have people on TV who look like the people that they want to sell the product to, saying, I take Prevagen because it makes my mind show, or I'm using this particular drug because it makes my plaque psoriasis go. It's the extent that you can get a friend or a peer to endorse something that's where your real power is in advertising and marketing. It's not the concept, it's not the idea, it's not even the pitch, it's the relationship. And those relationships that listeners build with talk radio hosts are incredibly strong, and on the left and the right. And that's why I feel it's so important, and why I wrote this piece that was originally published in The Nation. Why I wrote this piece that, basically saying to left-wing billionaires, the GOP is getting about $5 billion a year worth of free promotion through this 1,500 right-wing radio stations running 24/7. And what do Democrats do? Every 2 years, they drop $1 billion. Every 4 years, they drop $2 or $3 billion in paid advertising, when they could have had, every single day of the year, they could have had somebody on the air, ideally locally, but nationally as well, pounding on Republicans and promoting Democratic candidates. It's pretty straightforward stuff. And so I'm calling on our billionaires, and there's a few out there, In fact, one of the radio stations I'm on is actually owned by one of them, but he's not like a uber billionaire, very wealthy guy. I'm calling on the really wealthy progressives out there to seriously think about, in fact, about buying a radio network. In fact, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when Clear Channel was up for sale, it had been sucked dry by Mitt Romney's Bain Capital, and the husk had been thrown away, and it was in bankruptcy, and it was for sale for $1.1 or $1.2 billion, which is chump change for some people. And I wrote an op-ed at the time to Tom Steyer saying, Tom, if you want to put your money in something instead of running for president, buy Clear Channel. I think it was probably beyond his means, but it's not beyond the means of other people.
How many stations did Clear Channel have?
The Clear Channel at that time, I think, had just a little short of or a little over 900 stations.
I thought one of the most telling points you made is Eric Cantor was a congressman from Virginia, and he rose to be the number 2 most powerful person in the House of Representatives under the Republican Speaker, John Boehner. And he was upset in 2014 by someone whose name nobody knew. Describe how David Bratt pulled it off.
Yeah, Dave Bratt was an obscure junior college professor who had hung around the fringes of right-wing politics for years. And Eric Cantor had been, basically taking the entire political system for granted because he was able to raise almost unlimited amounts of money because he was the number 2 Republican in a Republican-controlled House. And he had John Boehner, and between the two of them, they had these huge PACs and all this money. And, he spent $5 million in the primary, which is mind-boggling for one district in Virginia. And Dave Bratt spent $200,000. Cantor had, professional media people, professional campaign consultants, the very best in the business. Dave Bratt hired a kid in his 20s who had never run a campaign before. And like I said, he raised $200,000. That was it. But what happened was the right-wing hosts around the country were at that point in time just getting over it with Boehner and Cantor being kind of their version of what, the way that you and I would view, Clinton and Gore, kind of, get along and go along kind of guys, and they wanted somebody who was a real conservative. And Dave Bratt was that guy. And so one of the things that the Bratt campaign was shocked to discover was that they were getting these like $10,000 and $20,000 wads of money. They were actually, bundles of small, lots and lots of small contributions that were coming in at like, 11 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock in the morning. And it's like, what the hell? Where's all this money coming from? And it turned out it was right-wing, nationally syndicated right-wing hosts broadcasting mostly out of the East Coast, but they were being time delayed into the West Coast to push them into drive time or just after drive time. And they had picked up the cause of Dave Bratt. So, without the consultants, without the money, without the advertising, even in the district, Dave Bratt was able to take down the second most powerful Republican in the House of Representatives. It was pretty mind-boggling. It was entirely talk radio.
Well, on another point, I remember I used to go on these major local radio shows like Jackson Show in Los Angeles, Jerry Williams in Boston. They had large local audiences. We could talk about consumer protection, corporate abuses, even offer our materials to the listening audience. They would let us put the address on. And I remember once I did a whole circuit of these with our book, Winning the Insurance Game, how to learn enough about insurance to buy better, cheaper, more reliable auto insurance and health insurance, life insurance, homeowner insurance. And in about a year, thousands of these books were called for by the audience all over the country. We distributed them. All of that's completely gone now.
Yeah, and you'll recall Michael Jackson. I used to, whenever I visit Los Angeles, I'd pop Michael Jackson's show on if he was on when I was there, because he was a progressive. He was doing talk radio. He would have guests on from time to time, but he did a lot of rants all by himself, and he interacted with his callers a lot. And Michael Jackson with that very elegant British accent.
Yeah, and they're all replaced by these syndicated radio talk show hosts like we just talked, Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Levin and Savage and others. Jerry Williams was at WBBM in Chicago when Unsafe Speed came out. I couldn't get on Mutual Radio broadcast system. I couldn't get on CBS radio. I couldn't get on ABC radio. I went to Chicago, and he put me on. He was the first person to put me on. He said they got a lot of flack from upstairs, and the advertising office because the auto companies are advertising on this big Chicago station. That doesn't happen anymore. I mean, the younger people who try to break through with prominent investigative material in books, they just don't know what they're missing anymore. And I think the Fairness Doctrine did have an effect. When they abolished the Fairness Doctrine, they abolished a federal communication rule. That was abolished under George Herbert Walker Bush in 1987. And when they abolished it at the FCC, I was there as a packed hearing, and the FCC, in a split vote, got rid of it. The Fairness Doctrine said that if you put on a point of view, let's say you're pro-nuclear power, you put on a lot of people on pro-nuclear power, you have an obligation to inform the audience about opposing viewpoints. There was no real enforcement of it, but I'll tell you, a lot of the radio stations took it seriously enough to be more balanced in who they put on the air. And some people say when that was abolished, that gave an opportunity not just for talk show radio hosts being conservative, it didn't affect that, but for being way out. In effect, for being in cahoots, Tom, with prominent candidates. I mean, there are legal experts now, former general counsel of the FCC, Bruce Fine, who think that people like Sean Hannity, who continually talked with Trump, strategized with Trump about electoral issues, about his reelection, that was basically a campaign finance violation because it amounted to a donation by Sean Hannity. He didn't report it and he didn't disclose it as such for the Federal Election Commission. What do you think of all that?
Broadly, I agree. I worked in radio when the Fairness Doctrine was in place. And I can tell you that the legal bite, and the reason why you say it wasn't generally enforced, I think a lot of people don't get the nuance of it. The Fairness Doctrine said that radio and television stations, when their licenses would be considered for renewal, which is more or less every 2 years, would have to demonstrate that they had programmed in the public interest, number one. And that was generally considered to mean you had to carry news at the top of the hour on radio, and you had to carry an hour of news block in primetime on television. And then secondly, if the ownership or management of a radio or television station expressed an opinion on the air, that radio or television station was required to find a person in the local community to express a countervailing opinion. And that was part of my job when I started at WITL as a teenager. Chuck Mefford was one of the owners of the station. He had a talk show in the afternoon, but he was an owner of the station. And he would do an opinion piece. I also worked at WGIM-TV in Lansing, Michigan. Same deal. It was a local family. In fact, they named the station after their new baby boy. It was Jim. And the owner of the station would come on and do a 2 or 3 minute rant about, the new millage increase to pay for Potter Park. And my job was to go out and find somebody to record a 2 or 3 minute piece to balance that. And they took that very seriously because that was an actual requirement of the Fairness Doctrine, was that if it was the station ownership or management, it had to be balanced. But if it was just some host or some show, there was no legal requirement for balance. But as you point out, Ralph, they tried to get that balance anyway, because that kind of defined the zeitgeist. That defined the water that we all swam in. And so even when Chuck on his radio show on WITL is 3 to 4 p.m. everyday radio show that I helped produce, when he would go off in a really strong way on a particular topic, he would toss it later on after we got off the air. He'd say, why don't you see if you can find somebody who disagrees with me on that? We'll get him on. I would like to try to keep it, a semblance of balance here, even though it wasn't required to.
We're talking with Thom Hartmann, syndicated radio show host, 3 hours every day on weekday. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week.
I mean, I don't know how you do it. And he also, at the same time, is a scholarly author of all kinds of books, including the recent series, The Secret History of Oligarchy, Secret History of Monopoly, etc. And he just pours them out, and they're really thorough and clearly written. But just to show our listeners who may not know this about the decay since the 1934 Communications Act was passed under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and even before that, when Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce and radio was just coming on board in the 1920s, he called radio so much a sacred trust that he opposed any advertising. Any advertising. Anyway, the 1934 Act then made that famous clause, the public interest, convenience, and necessity standard for all radio and later TV stations because they use the public airways. We own it. We're the landlords. The radio and TV stations are the tenants. They pay us no rent. They get the use free 24/7 compliments of Congress and the Federal Communications Commission, and they decide who says what and who doesn't on our public airways. I accused Rush once that he was the king of corporate welfare. He didn't know what I was talking about. And I said, well, you're using the public airways free on all these stations all over the country and making tremendous money. He makes almost $1 million a week. And you ought to pay tribute to the taxpayer, to the people who give you this free use of the public airways. Well, anyway, going forward from 1934 was nothing more than a whole series of decay until it reached a point now where the liberal progressive establishment in this country has basically given up on having their viewpoints on talk radio. It's just amazing to see even very young people are all into the internet now. They don't even know what's been taken away from them. After World War II, there was a national radio program called Voice of Labor. And your research, I'm sure you came across it, was supported by the labor unions. And it was all over the country. There isn't even a Voice of Labor. The AFL-CIO has shown very little interest in radio or talk radio. And it just keeps getting worse and worse. What do you see as a turnaround here?
Well, to add a historical punctuation point to what you're saying, when I started my show in 2003, we started it on a local station in Vermont as a way of showing, as proof of concept. I just wanted to, I had written an op-ed that was published on Common Dreams called Talking Back to Talk Radio that became the first business plan for Air America Radio. They had brought me in as a consultant to help set it up, but a year before they got their act together, I wanted to prove it was possible. And so I found this local radio station in Vermont and said, can I do a couple hours on a Saturday morning? And they were like, sure, let's see what happens. And within about 6 months, I got picked up by the only progressive radio network in America. I was on 27 stations across the country and Sirius satellite radio. And that was called the IE America Radio Network. And it was owned by the United Auto Workers, the UAW. It was based out of Detroit. And even though I was living in Vermont, I was on this network out of Detroit, and we were on stations all over the country. And then I forget the names of the UAW CEOs at that time, but the guy who had started that thing died. And the new guy who came in said, oh, we don't need this radio stuff, and it's losing money for us. And so he killed that network. And so I just went back being independent for a couple of years and then, went back on Air America.
More default, as in your article described, people wondered, how did Trump in the last election in November pick up so many Hispanic votes? And, all the political pundits trying to figure it out. Well, you gave a very important reason why.
Oh, yeah. Conservatives are buying Spanish language stations like there's no tomorrow. Or they're leasing them and putting Spanish language right-wing talk onto them. It's a huge thing in southern Florida and across Texas right now, but it's spreading all over the country. And people think of right-wing talk radio as just being, Limbaugh and Hannity and those guys. But there is Hispanic or Spanish language right-wing talk radio. And then there's Christian right-wing talk radio. There's a lot of these stations, a lot of these broadcasters, I think probably Pat Robertson blazed the trail for this and made himself $1 billion in the process, who are using their tax-exempt status to good advantage to broadcast with a good dose of religion thrown in, but their message is overtly political every single day. So it's not just the 1,500 explicitly right-wing radio, mostly programming to white right-wingers, across America. It's not just them. It's all these Spanish language stations that are increasingly going right-wing, and it's all these religious stations that are everywhere that are going aggressively more right-wing.
And by the way, every morning, a lot of these talk show hosts get a memo from any one of the right-wing corporate think tanks in Washington about talking points for the day, for the news. So they get that research backing. Well, why did the last attempt to have progressive radio syndicated all over the country, Air America, you were associated with that in some way. Why did that fail? It raised quite a few millions of dollars, had Al Franken on and others. Yeah. Why did it fail?
Principally, I would say 90% of the failure of Air America was a lack of appropriate funding. When Air America declared bankruptcy, they were $17 million in the hole. When Rupert Murdoch started Fox News, he lost $100 million a year for the first 5 years before he made a penny. But Shelley and Anita Drobny were the people who read my article and Talking Back to Talk Radio back in early 2003 and called me up and said, will you come out to Chicago and talk to us? We're venture capitalists and we want to do a radio network based on what you're saying. And I was like, sure. I went out there. We got it into reasonable shape in terms of a business plan. They brought in John Sinton, an old FM radio guy and a friend who was really good. And then they brought in this guy, Evan Cohen, I think was his name, as I recall, who claimed that he had access to tens of millions of dollars, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars. And he brought a big wad of cash with him. It turned out he had stolen that money from the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. He thought he was going to use the radio network to leverage more money out of people. He was a professional con man. He left the network broke. He fled the country. He eventually got caught. But Air America was, 5-6 months into being on the air in 56 in 56 markets all across the country at that point. And so they just limped along, desperately begging at places like the Democracy Alliance conference, desperately begging for money, getting $1 million here and 300,000 there and 2 million here. And it's just, you can't run a radio network that way. But, sadly, a lot of wealthy progressives will tell you, oh, well, that was a disaster. It was an experiment. We should never do that again. When in fact, yes, there were some basically incompetent people in management at Air America Radio at various times, but they were not the ones who killed it. What killed it was the lack of appropriate funding. They should have started that network with at least $40-50 million in the bank. Mm-hmm. And instead they started it with about $1.
In terms of forward looking, you have a real platform here, basically saying this is what we have to do. Why don't you go through it one by one?
Sure. I laid it out in this article that we're talking about. And I said, first of all, the Democratic Party should put together a task force to create a national progressive talk radio strategy. And I'm not talking about bringing back the Fairness Doctrine or the personal attack rule or any of that kind of stuff, but how do we help make progressive talk radio work? Number two, there are progressive talk radio stations around the country. I'm on most of them. And, they're getting by, but radio's a business with very razor thin margins. And so if they could put together a sponsorship network and get companies that like their affiliation with the Democratic Party's companies that are unionized, for example, get them to say, yes, we will commit to progressive talk radio. They need to start a lot of local shows. This is the farm team. There are literally, when I go to these conferences, these talkers conferences, there'll be 200 local talk show hosts from all over the country. And every single one of them is a conservative because, they're doing the morning show on the station that has Rush Limbaugh on the afternoon. And so, we need to build up that. We need to build up our farm team because radio is just like writing or anything else. And Ralph, I know you know this well. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And it's not something that just, it's not a matter of some brilliant talent suddenly appears here. Rush Limbaugh started in radio the same time I did. We're the exact same age. We both started as teenagers in local music radio. So you got to do that. We got to bring back legislation to break up these giant monopolies and return radio and television station ownership back at least to local ownership at the state level. And another thing we need to do is expand low power FM. Here in Portland, Oregon, where I live, a group of local people got together. They were led by Jefferson Smith, a local activist who started the Bus Project and had been in the state legislature for a while. And they put up a low power FM station. Low power FM stations, putting a big AM stick on the air can cost you a couple $1 million. Putting a low power FM station on the air, you can do that for a couple $100,000.
How many of those are operating? There were a lot of opportunities, more licenses available from the FCC last I heard about it than were taken by people in local communities. What's the story now on that?
Well, the Republicans, whenever the Republicans run the FCC, they make it almost impossible to get low power FM signals. So during the Bush and Trump administrations, the FCC just was not passing these things out. But there is the potential for as many as 20,000 low power FM signals around the country.
And what's their range?
Well, typically, depending on the terrain, there's physical things, but typically you can throw a signal about in a 10-mile radius. The station here in Portland I believe their signal is in downtown Portland. I can hear it. I live in the north end of Portland. And you can sometimes you can double and triple them up. I mean, the one here in Portland, now they've got another station, another low power FM across the Columbia River in Vancouver, Washington, which is, a fairly good sized town, that is simulcasting. And so now they're on, they're in two places, and they help flip Clark County, Vancouver, Washington, blue. So that's, I'm on low power FM stations in Columbus, Ohio, and Grand Rapids, Michigan, and other places. And so, we need a lot of these things, and they can be done by local community groups. Like I said, it doesn't take a lot of money.
We're talking with Thom Hartmann, just to reintroduce you, author of many great books on the history of corporate power and abuse and attempts to try to do something about it, as well as a daily syndicated radio talk show, 3 hours a day. I don't know how you do it, but you do it. But Thom, let me ask you a question that some of our listeners might have caught, who are more likely to go with the Green Party or other progressive civic groups. You tied this reform package a little tightly with the Democratic Party. Do you have any problems with that?
Well, my argument, and I say this on the air a lot, and people will call up and they'll complain about their local Democratic Party, and I'll say, have you shown up at a local Democratic Party meeting? I mean, you can become a precinct committee person. In most places, they're begging for them, and the precinct committee people are the ones who decide who gets to run in the primaries and what the platform's going to be. I've had local Democratic parties all over the country that have been taken over by listeners to my show now since I've been on this hobby horse.
No, I understand that. My point is a little different. You run into problems with the Federal Election Commission, whether these are donations.
Are you
worried? Even the Republican Party, doesn't overtly try to build radio.
Well, that's why I'm not asking the party to fund anything. I did suggest that the party should put together a task force to look at this, and I know that a couple of members of Congress in the Progressive Caucus read this article and said, we really ought to do this. But they would not be looking at, getting themselves on radio or buying radio stations or doing anything that could be interpreted as a contribution in kind. Instead, they would be looking for ways that legislation could be passed that would open back up the radio airwaves, things like bringing back local ownership rules or bringing back the Fairness Doctrine.
I'm curious about the reaction by Nation magazine readers, and it was also reprinted in Progressive Populist, one of my favorite publications. We've had Art Cullen, the editor, on the show a couple of times. But the title is Talk Radio, Democrats Can't Win If They Don't Play. What kind of response? Really any functional response? A lot of pretty well-off New York people, Democrats, read Nation magazine and also around the world. Did you get much of a response, or were you sort of disappointed? Now, it's not like every day somebody writes an article like this. Yeah.
There is one fellow. Well, I got a lot of, attaboys, great article, let's hope something happens, that kind of stuff. But, talk is cheap. There was one guy who is an investment advisor to progressive billionaires. He's got a couple of clients whose names you might recognize, and he helps them decide where their money should go. He read this piece. He reached out to me and said, let me help you. Let's try to pitch this to a few people. And he helped get this article in front of and read by at least 3 billionaires that I know of, and that I know he did. But so far, we haven't found anybody who's going to nibble on it.
Is one of them Nick Hanauer from Seattle?
No, Nick's been on my show a number of times, and weirdly enough, somebody tweeted it at Nick, and Nick tweeted back saying, liberals don't want to listen to talk radio. Talk radio traffics in fear and hate, and that's not the way liberals think. And so I tweeted back at Nick saying, hey, I'm a liberal. I'm on the radio. You've been on my show. I don't traffic in hate and fear, and you got it wrong, Nick. And to the best of my knowledge, he never responded to me, and I'm not sure he even realized that I had said that.
But that's a very widespread attitude. It's a total defeatist attitude.
I agree.
And almost a bit removed from the reality of what people listen to in their car when they're going back and forth from work and going about shopping. I mean, it's as if these super wealthy people don't experience this. Therefore, they think everybody doesn't experience this and that radio's passé.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And, if you have a chauffeur driving you around, I don't know if that's the case with Nick or not. He seems a little more down to earth. And he's not a billionaire. He's just a multi-millionaire. He's a very wealthy guy, but he was one of the founders of Patriotic Millionaires, which is a great group. Him and Black and a few of these other guys who have also been on my program. But, I don't want to and have no real reason to criticize Nick. He's a good guy, and I think he just doesn't understand radio. And I think you're right, Ralph. I think these guys live in a rarefied world by and large, the billionaires anyway.
Well, it's enough evidence. All the evidence you need to know is, at least in my opinion, that right-wing talk radio did more than any other factor in changing blue-collar workers from Democratic voters, New Deal type voters, to Reagan Democrats. Would you agree?
Right. You're absolutely right. And it went on steroids during the Clinton administration. And frankly, I believe that if right-wing talk radio, let's say that right-wing talk radio is not a big, huge, powerful force, but just, a force, right? Let's say that they only add 2 or 3% to the electorate on one side, if they can only swing 2 or 3% of the vote, that's more than enough to put George Bush and Donald Trump in office.
I think it was much more than that. I think they swung 7 to 10 million blue-collar workers into the Republican camp for the duration.
I would agree. I was saying, even the most skeptical perspective would indicate that right-wing talk radio has put Republicans in the White House at least since Ronald Reagan. And had there been an equal presence in left-wing talk radio, I don't think Bush or Trump ever would have made it to the White House.
I agree. We shouldn't conclude this program without mentioning National Public Radio. NPR has some of the largest audiences in the country. Isn't that correct?
Right. That's correct. Yeah, they do. And, and a lot of people will say, well, you don't need progressive talk radio. You got NPR. NPR is scrupulously apolitical. It's a completely different thing from having
and it's corporate sponsored.
Yes. Well, although, I'm not quite so hysterical about that because my show is corporate sponsored also. And I've never had a corporation try to tell me how to change my politics. They can take it or leave it. But I think the big thing with NPR is that they're not telling people how to vote the way that I do and that Mark Levin and
right. My point was there's still a lot of people listening to radio per se.
Yeah.
I mean,
David
Brancaccio told me his audience for Marketplace is 11 million. I mean, and all things considered, which I think should be named Some Things Considered, has a huge audience. Morning Edition has a huge audience. So. Yes. The radio habit is not going away the Australian dodo. It's a lot of people still listen to radio. David, do you have a comment or question?
Yeah. When you were talking about Clear Channel, they racked up so much debt that I think at one point they were taken over by Bain Capital. Private equity owns these radio stations. Is it profitable? Have we proven that creating these radio conglomerates are not profitable? And isn't there something the Justice Department can do, the FTC could do, the FCC could do to block these mergers and break up these radio chains?
Yes, and that's at the core of, and there's an entire chapter about that as it applies to radio in my last book, The Hidden History of Monopolies, which Ralph wrote the foreword for. God bless you, Ralph. Thank you. And by the way, we got your cookbook a while ago, and it's great, Ralph. I just wanted to say. But to the point of the bankruptcy, Clear Channel was actually making money. I was about the third or fourth year of my show. I think it must have been around 2006 or 2007, thereabouts. The local Clear Channel station here in Portland, Oregon, had picked up Air America, KPOJ. They'd picked up the Air America lineup. And the local manager reached out to me and said, hey, if you come out to Portland, you can still do your national show. You can do it out of our studio. We'll give you a free studio and backstop you on the engineering end. And we'll also pay you a salary to do a morning show for us if you'd like to do 6 hours of radio every day. And I thought, hey, let's try it. Let's see what happens. And so, we came out here and did that. The station was doing good all across the country. Clear Channel was quite profitable. And then Mitt Romney's company, Bain Capital, came in and bought them. And this is, and I know you guys know probably a lot more about this than I do, and Ralph has been all over this for years, but the business model of these so-called private equity companies is basically to suck a company dry. I was working at Clear Channel at this station, and the first thing that happened was they came in and decertified the union, SAG-AFTRA. The second thing that happened was, literally within months of Bain Capital taking over Clear Channel, was the 10 or 12 or 15 people, I don't recall how many total, but there was a bunch of people who worked in the newsroom, and they had a lot of local music shows. I mean, we must have had 30 or 40 employees in that. There was 5 stations in that pod, a couple of music stations, a right-wing station that had Limbaugh on it, and a left-wing station that had me on it. And they fired pretty much everybody, All the radio stations went to voice tracked, to basically automated music coming out of New York. The sports station went to nationally syndicated sports. They shut down the progressive station, KPOJ. And, that was the end of that. And as Romney's company took over Clear Channel, that was when they started dropping the Air America shows like crazy. And that was also one of the things that helped kill Air America, because most of the stations that Air America was on were Clear Channel stations.
That's the business model. That's the same
right.
model that these companies taking over newspapers all over the country. First thing they do is they fire local reporters. They don't want to pay the salaries, and they use a lot of syndicated puff material. But from what you described, Tom, this is a violation of the 1934 Communications Act. You can't strip mine radio and TV using the public airways to that level and still meet the standard of public interest, convenience, and necessity. Why aren't there more lawsuits by, companies in these areas that have been displaced?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer, Ralph. That would be something for people that who are good litigators in that area. By the way, this didn't just happen to Clear Channel. Cumulus, which was the second largest radio network in the country with about 800 stations, same thing. They got taken over by venture capitalists. They got sucked to dry. It took less than a year, as I recall. And they just came out, went into bankruptcy early last year, as I recall.
I'm confused, Tom, because I understood that venture capital bought up all these radio conglomerates because the radio conglomerates were in trouble, that they had incurred so much debt buying up too many stations, that the business model, big, doesn't work in radio. That was my understanding.
I'm not sure that's true, David. I can't speak authoritatively. I've never carefully examined all the details of the takeover of Clear Channel, even though I was working there at the time. But
it was my understanding that Clear Channel, their eyes were bigger than their stomach, that they ended up buying way too many stations.
They had economies of scale. I mean, they had substantial economies of scale that would argue for profitability. Whether they were able to pull that off or not, frankly, I don't know.
I think they had way too much debt, Clear Channel.
It may be, although would Mitt Romney take over a company that had debt? Well, maybe. I don't know. That's not my area of expertise.
Something clearly happened. Whether they underinvested as they strip mined their programs, but for example, they owned a radio station in North Dakota, and it was completely automated. So when there was a terrible natural disaster approaching, usually the local station would be right on informing people about this and that, and it was basically irrelevant because it was being programmed by some office 1,000 miles away, and there was nobody there except the machinery. Now, that's the failure of the Federal Communications Commission, and more generically, the utter failure of a media indentured Congress to do anything about it.
Yeah, and in that case, there was a train that derailed, and they were leaking poisonous chlorine gas, and there were 5 radio stations in that town. I thought it was in Idaho, but there were a couple of radio stations in that town, and the authorities were desperately calling these radio stations, saying, "Please put out the alert. People are going to die." And every single radio station was being programmed out of state. They didn't even have engineers on duty at the time, which used to be a requirement when I was in radio back in the 60s and early 70s. And as a result, people did die.
Well, our listeners should put pen to paper, as they used to say in the old days, and ask their senators and representative, are they aware of all this? Do they know that there should be oversight hearings of the moribund Federal Communications Commission, which reached an all-time low under Donald Trump, as you might imagine?
Oh, yeah.
I remember Byron Dorgan, the senator in the well of the Senate, he's from North Dakota, complained specifically what Ralph was talking about. So he couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Well, here it is. We own it. The public airways, we own it. The corporations control it, decide who says what and who doesn't say what on our property 24 hours a day. And we're all asleep at the switch. We have to close now. We've been talking with Thom Hartmann. Tom, give our listeners your best contact numbers so they can get the stream of information you pour out every day during the week.
Well, ThomHartmann.com is my website, and however you spell it will get you there. We have all 4 misspellings. And I write every day over at medium.com and at ThomHartmann.medium.com and THOM Hartman with 2 N's. And you can find my books anywhere you find books. Thank you for asking, Ralph.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you, Tom. To be continued. You're opening up this whole talk radio issue from the inside and from the outside based on your historical knowledge of corporate power and media, and we thank you for that. And I hope you're going to generate a lot more follow-up on this important article that appeared in The Nation magazine and republished in Progressive Populist, February 1, 2021, called Talk Radio, Democrats Can't Win If They Don't Play. I might add, the American people can't win if we don't have a more diverse talk radio. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Thom Hartmann. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Russell?
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, February 19, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Columbia Law professor John Coffey says that the Boeing Deferred Prosecution Agreement is one of the worst he's seen. The agreement included an unusual provision finding that a compliance monitor was not necessary because the misconduct was neither pervasive across the organization nor undertaken by a large number of employees nor facilitated by senior management. This is without precedent, Coffey told Corporate Crime Reporter in an interview last week. I have not seen that anywhere else, and I've looked at a number of deferred prosecution agreements. Not only was there no independent study by a reputable law firm, but when you look where the money went, only $500 million out of the $2.65 billion went to victims. $1.77 billion went to airline companies. It was imported to inflate the amount of the settlement. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrover along with David Feldman and Ralph. And hello, we must be going because that's our show. I want to thank our guest again, Thom Hartmann. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now for you podcast listeners. Stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
To support the American Museum of Tort Law, check out their online shop at store.tortmuseum.org. They have autographed books, flaming Pinto coffee mugs, and other unique gifts for all of you lawyers, law students, paralegals, and tort fans out there.
Producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we'll talk to the former head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Richard Cordry. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. This show with Thom Hartmann is a good background for all of you to try to get this show on more radio stations. I hope you'll do that.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up where we extend our conversation with Thom Hartmann.
The guy who's most active and outspoken, the politician who's most active and outspoken on this, I quote him in the article, is Congressman Ro Khanna out of California. He's on my show almost every week, taking calls from listeners for an hour.
Right.
And he's the one who told me that he wanted to create a talk radio caucus in the Democratic Party. I don't know if he's done anything with it or not, but if you want to get him on to follow up on this topic, he will wax eloquently about left-wing talk radio.
And he's close to Warren and Sanders in the Senate.
Oh, he was the vice chair of Bernie's campaign.
They got to make this a priority. It's everybody's last issue, you know. You can't believe the silence on this and indifference on this in Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
over the years. You know, we look back to Nick Johnson. Bring back Nick Johnson. Where are you?
Well, the other thing is, and we didn't mention this, is frankly, I think that had Air America not happened, I don't think Barack Obama would have got elected in 2008. And then after Obama becomes elected, all of a sudden the Democrats are no longer interested in subsidizing Air America, and Air America goes away. You know, and the other thing is, when George Bush was president, twice a year I was invited to the White House to come do my show from the White House. They set up these long rows of tables on the White House grass on the lawn, and they'd wire it all up for us and make it all work, and we'd do our shows from there, and Bush would come out and Cheney would come out and all this kind of stuff. During the 8 years of Obama's administration, he completely ignored talk radio.
Just makes your point.
Yeah.
Well, we're about out of time, Tom, unless Steve and Dave have a compelling observation or question to ask.
I was curious if there's ideological product placement in a show like Sean Hannity's or Rush Limbaugh, whether or not the Koch brothers pay them to read talking points. Have you heard anything?
Yes, there is, and yes, they do. This was exposed in an article that was written about 5-6 years ago, and it was published in Politico by, I want to say, Dave Vogel. I think there's a hot link in my article to that article, where the Heritage Foundation was giving Limbaugh a couple $1 million a year. They were giving Hannity $1 million a year, and other hosts relatively smaller amounts. And it's not just Heritage. There are numerous right-wing think tanks and whatnot. I once got to know quite well. I traveled to a World Crisis Center with a kind of mid-level right-wing talk show host. He was nationally syndicated. He was on about 400 stations, but most people wouldn't recognize his name. Right-wing talk radio is so omnipresent. There's the A list, the B list, and the C list even. And we were talking about income, and he said, "Yeah, I only make about, my salary is like $35,000 a year, but I make about $300,000-400,000 a year in speaking fees for these groups, and I'll just show up once and give a 1-hour speech, and they'll give me a $150,000 check, and it's really a subsidy, essentially." So there's a lot of that going on the right. There's literally nothing like that on the left. Nobody's ever given me a damn penny. So
people need to know that.
This is pretty astonishing.
People need to know that.
We've got to get congressional hearings and FCC hearings on this. There are a couple good FCC commissioners. They're outnumbered by the Republican majority, but that's going to be changing under Joe Biden. I mean, this is sheer corruption you're talking about, Tom. So
it's almost like payola.
Yeah. There are a lot of laws against this sort of thing, especially if they're not disclosed.
Problem is those laws are not enforced.
Is radio, like, I don't think my kids who are in their 20s and 30s listen to the radio. Is radio going by the wayside? I mean, isn't it social media? Isn't it Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and these ways? What? Do you think radio will still stick around?
For the gestalt here that Ralph and I are discussing, or that's the wrong word, but, for this medium, of talk radio, number one, most talk radio is listened to while people are driving. But number two, what I have done with my show, Rush Limbaugh has done with his show, and Mark Levin has done with his show, and that is that, yes, I'm on the radio. If you're in Chicago, you can tune to WCPT and hear me, for example. But if you're in Chicago, you can also say to your smart speaker, play Thom Hartmann, and it'll play my show. You can also get my free 1-hour podcast, which is a cut down of all 3 hours. It's got an ad on the front end that pays for it. You can also give me $6 a month, I think it is, and get all 3 hours of the show every single day, 5 days a week, as a podcast, in whatever format you want. It's on Apple, it's everywhere. And you can also watch me live as video on YouTube. You can also watch the show cut into pieces after we're no longer live on YouTube. We've got a channel with, over 100,000 subscribers. You can also watch me live on Twitter. You can also watch me live on Periscope. I mean, we're creating all these simultaneous streams out of this one talk show, but it's still anchored in radio. And like I said, everybody is doing this. So to the extent that radio might be fading, and there was a piece in one of the paper, I think it might have been the New York Times even a day or two ago, maybe the Washington Post, about how Rush Limbaugh is dying and so is radio. Yeah, but what's happening is that the people who are using radio as a political platform, as a voice, the way that I'm doing it, that Michael Savage is doing it, that Mark Levin is doing it, and Rush Limbaugh are doing it, we're very much keeping up with the times. And our rants, our guests, our point of view are all widely available. And then as I mentioned earlier when we were talking off the air, every single morning when I get up, my first job, and it takes me about an hour and a half every morning, is to write, a 500 to 1,500 word op-ed that I publish over at thomhartman.medium.com that then becomes the first rant in the first hour of my show, and that we publish in the newsletter. We have a free newsletter that we push out to tens of thousands of people every single day, which includes links to every article that I talk about throughout the show. And that very often gets picked up by progressive websites like The Populist, Common Dreams, Raw Story, etc., Alternet and things like that. I mean, all of them are typically publishing at least one of my pieces every week. All of that is coming out of the fact that I'm on the radio.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome the former head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Richard Cordry. Until next time.
Stand up, Stand up, you've been sitting way